Okay, this is podcast number 2 for chapter 1. And in this one, we're going to take a quick look at the different organ systems that make up the human body, and then we're going to start talking about the language that we're going to use when we talk about these different systems. So when we talk about our body systems, we are going to separate them into functions. So the first is your body covering. Your major system involved with your body covering is called your integumentary, so it's your skin, hair, nails, all that stuff. You have your body systems that are involved with support and movement, so your skeletal and muscular systems. They have to work together to allow you to move. They also give you protection. Integration and coordination, so everything in your body has to be controlled. The main system that's going to do that is your nervous system with help from your endocrine system. Transport, we have to move stuff around the body, so your cardiovascular or circulatory system is going to be mainly doing that by everything being dissolved in the blood and then moving through the blood. But your lymphatic system also is going to help with this, and that plays a big role in your immune system. Absorption and excretion, so we have to get stuff into our cells and we have to get rid of waste products. So the digestive system is going to help us get stuff in, along with the respiratory system, but the respiratory is also going to help us get stuff out, along with the urinary system, so we can get rid of waste products. And then you have your reproductive system. That's one of the systems we actually do not go into detail with this year because it's not really a main part of homeostasis as it is like many of the other systems. We will talk a little bit when we do the endocrine system, though. All right, so we're going to talk about the language of anatomy. So when we talk about things in the human body, they actually have certain terms that we're going to use. Every time that we talk about the organs in the body, we are talking about them being in the correct anatomical position. So anatomical position is when you are standing facing forward, your palms are out, your feet are forward. That's the correct anatomical position. So anytime that we're talking about something, and that's going to matter when we're talking about the orientation of bones in the arm, in the wrist, and stuff like that. So it's got to be palms up. If you have a body laying down on its back, it's got to be laying down in the correct anatomical position. Okay, and then prone, that's called supine, and prone is laying face down in the anatomical position. So you have supine and prone. But mainly we're going to think about everything being in our regular anatomical position, palms forward. Okay, so when we talk about the body parts, we're going to be using anatomical directions when we talk about things. The most common that we're going to use, we have anterior, which is also called ventral. We saw that when we talked about the ventral cavity. So that means the front or belly side of the body. So anterior means front, ventral also means front. The opposite of that is posterior or dorsal, and that is the back of the human body. So remember, we talked about dorsal fin on the back of a shark. That's one way you can remember that dorsal means back, and posterior is the back side. Now remember, when we talk about left and right inside the body, it is the left and right of the subject, not of the observer. So when I talk about the right side of the heart, it's the right side of the heart inside of me. So if you were looking at me and pointing at my right side of my heart, you'd actually be pointing to the left of my body. So it's just something to keep in mind, and I'll demonstrate that more in class. Okay, so here are many of the different terms that we're going to be looking at. So again, this is what I'm talking about when you talk about right and left. Like when you're looking at her, you're like, oh, that's the left, but that's actually her right. So if I were going to point to her heart, it would be the right side of the heart would be on the right side of her body, even though it's opposite of what you think of. So we have a lot of different terms that we're going to be using. So here's our anterior, posterior that we just talked about, but we also have superior and inferior. There's proximal and distal, which you'll see, medial and lateral. So we're going to talk about what each of these terms and how we use them. Cranial or cephalic means towards the head. Both of those words have to do with the head. So you can think about, when you talk about something cranial, that's towards the head. That also relates to superior, which means above or toward the head as well. So you have superior, cranial, or cephalic. Those are all going to mean up here towards the head. Caudal means towards the tailbone or coccyx, so you're heading down. And another word for that is inferior. So again, down here going towards the feet or below something else, then we're talking about inferior. So a lot of times we're going to use these words kind of together. Like you can say the femur is inferior to the tibia. So they have to kind of be used with two other things. You can't just say, oh, your knee is inferior. It's got to be inferior to something. Okay, so you can say your knee is inferior to your heart. Okay. A couple other words we're going to talk about are medial and lateral. So if you look at this picture, if you imagine there's an imaginary line going right down the center of her face, medial means something that is towards the center of that line, and lateral is anything that is away from the center of the line. And again, we have to talk about things in reference to something else. So the eyes are medial to the ears. They're closer to the center of the line than the ears are. Okay. Another word we can use, proximal and distal. And these are typically used when we're talking about your limbs, your arms or your legs. And you have to think about where the point of attachment is for the limb, and then you talk about things being either close to that point of attachment or far away from that point of attachment. So you could say the wrist is distal to the elbow. It's further away from the point of attachment than the elbow is. So the elbow is proximal to the point of attachment. So you have to kind of look at it that way. Again, all of these terms have to be used in reference to something else. You can't just say the thumb is distal. It's got to be distal to something. Okay. Superficial and deep are another example we can use. Superficial means near the body's surface. So you can think of your skin as being superficial, and deep is further in. So the further into the center of the body you go, the deeper you're talking about organs being. So some very deep organs could be like your intestines would be, right in the center. Whereas more superficial, you would have your bones are more superficial. Say your rib cage is superficial to your heart. It's on the outside of the heart. Your heart is deeper within the body. Okay. So again, here's a quick review of some of these major terms. Superior also can use the word cranial, meaning towards the head, so pointing up. The opposite of that is inferior or caudal, that's going down. And you can even think of that somebody who thinks they're superior, thinks they're better than everybody else. You have your posterior and anterior, and remember anterior also you can use the word ventral. And for posterior you can also use the word dorsal. And that would be different if we were talking about a four-legged creature. But luckily we don't talk about that in anatomy and physiology. Lateral and medial. Lateral is away from that imaginary line that goes down the middle. Medial is going towards it. Okay. So we have a lot of different terms that we can use when we talk about these. Now we also can take the body and we can divide the body into imaginary planes. And this is often used in medicine when we're talking about if you're doing a CAT scan or a X-ray. They will use the names of the different body planes to describe the image that they're looking at. So the first is called the axial or transverse plane, and this is basically it's a horizontal divide, so you're cutting the body into superior and inferior parts. So it's also called a cross section. So here you'd have a cross section of the abdomen, and you can see like you have the kidneys here, and there's some liver up in there. And, here are your two kidneys. There's your liver. That's your digestive tract. So you can kind of see all of the organs in this cross section when you're talking about the axial plane. The sagittal or median plane is going to divide the body into right and left sides. So that's going to cut right down the middle of the body, right down the midline. If you go directly down the middle, that's called mid-sagittal. So that's a direct cut down the middle. But sagittal can be anywhere along the way, so long as it's cutting it into right and left halves. Doesn't necessarily have to be equal. So this is showing you a mid-sagittal cut of the brain, and shows the center of the brain, and these are actually called ventricles in the brain that are openings within the brain. You can actually see that, and you can see all the different parts of the brain when you look at this mid-sagittal cut of it. So that's another way that we can kind of do imaging when we're looking at the body parts. And then finally, you have your coronal or frontal plane. And this is dividing the body into front and back sections. So you have your anterior, which is all the body's parts in the front of the cut. And then your posterior would be all the parts in the back. So imagine like a plane of glass coming down and cutting somebody from the head down to the foot. And you have the front part of the body and you have the back part of the body. And a lot of times our imaging types of things, CAT scans and stuff, can give us this kind of view where we can look. So here, if you look at this, you can see the liver and the stomach is coming over here, and it gives you a view of the organs, and you can actually go deeper and deeper within by using these different imaging technologies. So that's the last of the planes. Okay, so here's just a quick another view of the planes, a couple of different ways. But remember, so your sagittal is right and left halves. Okay, your transverse is your horizontal. You're just cutting the body in top and bottom halves. And then coronal, the frontal plane, is you're cutting it into a back half and a front half. Okay, and that's the end of this podcast, and we'll be moving on to chapter 2 from here.